Okay, so thanks again, Gina, for the invitation. I'm David Marshak with Foundation Medicine, and my focus is on patient engagement. So I get to know folks who have had biomarker testing or have an experience with it, and are open to sharing their experiences in a way that can help other patients. And so really excited to be joining today, teaching you all, answering your questions, and also being available to you afterward to answer any more questions, or if you have an interest in being in touch with me and sharing your experience, happy to connect in that way. So also very happy to be joined by my colleague, Katy Wong from our medical affairs team. So I'll hand it over to Katy.
Thank you, David. And yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm Katy Wong. I am a PhD scientist with Foundation Medicine. So I've been with Foundation now for just about 2 years and been doing oncology research for, oh my gosh, like 15 plus years. So very happy to be spending this evening with you. Happy to answer any questions through chat or live about biomarker testing in non-small cell lung cancer and specifically in ALK positive non-small cell lung cancer. I have a couple of slides, but I don't know if there are questions in the beginning that people have, or I can jump into kind of like a brief background intro to what we do at Foundation Medicine.
Yeah, let's just do an intro, and if people have questions,
the poll question, Gina? Do we want to do the poll question now?
Yes, I totally forgot about that. Thanks for reminding me. Okay, just so we can get to know who all is here, I'm going to go ahead and start a poll. So the very first thing we want to ask is, how long have you since your diagnosis? So I'll let you guys just kind of fill that in for us and let us see about who's here. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to end this poll and let's just let you guys see the results here. You can see, can you guys see? I just want to make sure I'm doing it right. It looks like 24% of our people are 1 year or under. So there's a lot of newbies here. 45% are 1 to 2 years. 18% are 3 to 4 years. Nobody is 5 to 6 years, but I am, but I can't participate in the poll when I'm doing it. So I could be one of those. And then we have 11% is 7 to 8 years, yay, and 3% is more than 8 years. So that is awesome. Now we're gonna go ahead and ask another question. We just wanna know what drug you're on. Oh, sorry, my bad, let's try that again. Yeah, so we just wanna see what kind of treatment you're on. And so if you can just tell us what type of treatment you're on. And there's quite a few options here. Unfortunately, you can only choose one. Sometimes we're in combination therapy, but it's really interesting to see kind of who's on what medication. All right, and I'm going to end the poll here. If you want to get your last answers in, there you go. And you can just see that predominantly almost everybody's on alectinib or Alecensa. So that's really interesting. That's first line, and that shows that it's working. So, and the last question I wanted to share with you is just about biomarker testing. And so I want to see basically if you've ever had any biomarker testing, if it's been tested on tissue, blood and tissue. Or if you had a single gene panel, they're sometimes called an assay test, where they just look for like maybe 1, 2, sometimes 5 biomarkers. Or if you've had comprehensive biomarker testing, which is the thing that we typically advocate for, because we like to see basically the DNA of cancer, see what's driving cancer so that we can figure out how to stop it. So I'm going to end the poll here and we'll share the results. So you can see that most people have had comprehensive biomarker testing. So really interesting. That's great to know too, because with tissue. And I'm hoping that Katie and David can kind of talk about some of the misconceptions. Some people believe that tissue is far better than blood. And so hopefully we can clear up some of those misconceptions. And we'll let Katie go ahead and just start the conversation, and we can just ask questions in the chat feature. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Awesome. And I just want to open up the chat so I have it here. So yeah, I'm going to give like a brief intro about some comprehensive genomic profiling. My disclosures is I am an employee of Foundation Medicine. I think this is a pie chart that probably everybody has seen. I think anybody who's heard of non-small cell lung cancer talk has seen this pie chart, and it's pretty amazing how the landscape of lung cancer has changed, where so many of these molecular markers we didn't even know about, 5 years ago, and couldn't even target, but now there's so many targetable therapies out there. And then zooming in on sort of the ALK piece of the pie chart. So ALK is a rearrangement in non-small cell lung cancer. It can occur in 3 to 7% of cases. ALK can be fused with multiple partners. So the most common is EML4 ALK, but ALK can have multiple fusion partners. And anytime shouldn't say anytime, but when it's fused with one of these partners, that's when it's going to be on. And when ALK is on all the time, that's when you're going to get this tumor growth. And that's what's causing those tumor cells to grow and grow and grow. The landscape for ALK TKIs has changed dramatically over the years. So there's multiple FDA-approved therapies that are out there. We just did that lovely poll where most of you are on the alectinib therapy, but there are other TKIs out there. But unfortunately, after being on these therapies, you can get acquired resistance. And this slide is just showing the different kind of resistance that can form over time. So when we talk about acquired resistance, so these are mutations that you would not find at the time of diagnosis, but after a tumor is exposed to therapy, it will actually change. And as it changes, it acquires these new mutations. And that's what you see here in this kind of bar graph. So this big alphabet soup, we can zoom in on the G1202R because that's one of the most common. These are acquired resistance mutations that happen after that tumor is exposed to therapy. So if you look at these pie charts, if a tumor is exposed to crizotinib, about 20 to 30% of the time, that tumor will get new ALK mutations. Most of these mutations are non-G1202R, but they are ALK mutations. You can also get ALK amplification, which means that you're getting an increase in the ALK DNA and an increase in the ALK protein. To complicate things, unfortunately, is if you're on a second generation ALK TKI, so not crizotinib, is that resistance landscape will change. So here, if you're on a second generation ALK TKI, such as alectinib, about 50 to 70% of the time, you get a ALK mutation, and the majority of those are that G1202R. And kind of the take-home message of like this resistance conversation is that this is why you need to get tested, is to see how your tumor is changing over time. What is therapy doing to your tumor? If you've responded to therapy, what's causing your tumor to grow again? And the reason it grows again is because of these resistance alterations. How do we know you have a resistance alteration? Comprehensive genomic profiling. Does a variant affect if I'll have resistance? So the different ALK variants can respond to therapies in different ways. To be honest, I've never seen a breakdown of these resistance mechanisms based on variant. I've seen it based on which drug the tumor is exposed to, but not based on variant. So that's a good question. Oh yes, okay, so I have this question about fish versus liquid biopsy. So let me show you, I can answer that question. I just want to give a brief getting into liquid biopsy. I'm just going to skip ahead here. Hold on one second. Just so we can all be on the same page talking about liquid biopsy. So when we talk about liquid biopsy at like Foundation Medicine, we're talking about collecting circulating tumor DNA from the blood. So circulating tumor DNA comes from tumor cells that when they die, they pop open and they release their contents into the bloodstream. And part of that contents is a circulating tumor DNA. So we're able to take a blood draw, you isolate the DNA from the blood, and then we can do the comprehensive genomic profiling on the blood. A lot of different factors can affect liquid biopsies, okay? So one is tumor burden. So the higher the tumor burden, the more likely you are to have ctDNA in the blood. So the more tumor, the more circulating tumor DNA, right? Also, timing of last therapy. So in order to detect or to increase your chances of detecting circulating tumor DNA, you really want that tumor actively growing and so actively shedding ctDNA in the blood. So if you're on therapy and your tumor is shrinking and responding, that's not the best time to get a liquid biopsy. You want that tumor actually progressing, and that'll increase your chances of getting circulating tumor DNA from a liquid biopsy. Okay. So that being said, if you get a negative liquid biopsy, the best is to try and follow up with a tissue biopsy, because if a liquid biopsy is negative, you don't know if it's a true negative. It could be negative because there's not enough tumor shedding DNA into the bloodstream, or there's just not enough circulating tumor DNA in order for us to detect on the assay. So in the case where an ALK rearrangement was detected by FISH, but it wasn't detected on liquid biopsy, it probably wasn't detected on liquid biopsy because either there wasn't enough circulating tumor DNA for us to detect it in the liquid sample, if that makes sense. If you're 6 years away from crizotinib therapy, will your tumors drop the resistance caused by that exposure? So it can really depend. So if you're on, it depends on if you've had intervening therapy. So if you've gone on crizotinib and then you've gone on alectinib, your resistance pattern is probably going to change because your resistance to crizotinib will be different than your resistance to alectinib. If you're on crizotinib and you've been therapy free for 6 months, it's hard to say if your resistance pattern mutations will change, but that tumor could definitely change over those 6 years, especially if it was not growing 6 years ago and now it is growing. There's a reason why it's growing now. So there probably is some sort of resistance mechanism that's developed. And sorry, if I don't fully answer or get one of your questions, please follow up in the chat by all means. Please define variant. Yeah, so with ALK, I mentioned that there are multiple fusions. There's multiple ways ALK can be fused, whether it's EML4K or there's KIF5B and all these other possible fusion partners here. So here you can see V1, that's called a variant 1. So it's it all depends on positioning. So a fusion means that there's a piece of EML4 fused with a piece of ALK. And these two pieces can be different sizes. And depending upon those sizes, those variants are classified in different ways. And hopefully you can kind of see that in this picture here. So all these blue pieces, that's the ALK kinase domain that's causing the tumor growth. And then here in the orange and green, these are all different sized pieces of EML4. So depending upon these different sizes, that's where you get these different variants. So here's variant 1 is this size, variant 2 is this size. So that's what I mean by there's different variants of EML4 ALK. What happens when we send a sample to NGS? How much tissue is needed? Is tissue better than liquid? Okay. So for tissue, we need 10 slides or like a block of tissue. For liquid, we need 2 tubes of blood. Is tissue better than liquid? There are pros and cons of each, or strengths and limitations. So one of the pros of liquid is it's less invasive, right? Generally, it's easier to do a blood draw than it is to do an invasive tissue biopsy. It can potentially be faster because it's easier to schedule a blood draw than it is to schedule a tissue biopsy. The major limitations around liquid comes around when I was talking about a negative, is that if you get a negative liquid, is that you really want to follow up with tissue because it's due to the biology of the tumor and the technical specifications of the assay. So that's one of the pros of tissue, is usually if you get a negative on a tissue, you can trust that negative. So I honestly wouldn't say that tissue is better or liquid is better, but there's strengths and weaknesses of both. And if you have access to both, that's fantastic. But if not, go for comprehensive genomic testing on what's available and what you have access to. Both can give you really good information.
Katie, when you say comprehensive genomic testing, is that the same thing as biomarker testing? I know there's like a lot of different words for it. So I was just wondering, like, sometimes it's difficult to know, like, is it genetics that we're talking about? Is it somatic mutations? Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So when we talk about genetics, that would be what you inherit from mom and dad. And what you would pass on to your children, and what in science would call germline. If we're talking about genomics, that's when we're talking about somatic. So those are acquired mutations that we all get from the environment and from the world. So genomics are things that are developed in an individual. And then as far as frankly, the lingo that Foundation uses is comprehensive genomic profiling. Biomarker profiling would be kind of synonymous. It would be the same.
Yeah.
We say comprehensive because when we read DNA, we read it, how I call it, we read it from top to bottom. And I kind of talk about it as if reading a book. So if we read the whole book, as opposed to something like hotspot testing, where you kind of get the cliff notes, where that hotspot testing is going to give you that, the very specific points, but comprehensive is you're going to get the whole book, which kind of gets to that whole, can you look at MET and HER if you only do liquid biopsy? Yes, you can on a Foundation test. So on a Foundation test, we do include MET and HER2 on our liquid assay. So the con of tissue.
I wanted to.
Oh, please.
Oh, sorry. Can I just add about the biomarker testing and comprehensive genomic profiling? So I think the way you can think of it is biomarker testing is probably the broad category. So comprehensive genomic profiling is a type of biomarker testing. Also included in biomarker testing would be like PD-L1 by IHC or something like that. And like with the poll question at the beginning, we were saying, did you have comprehensive testing where you're doing many, many genes, like a Foundation Medicine test, you're doing over 300 genes, or are you doing much smaller, like just a few genes at a time? Genetic testing, like what you inherit, and that's not as relevant for lung cancer, but I think that's often just called genetic or germline testing. So usually when you hear biomarker testing, it's talking about testing the tumor, but there are other synonyms you might hear as well, like tumor profiling, molecular profiling, or testing. So there are a lot of terms and it can be a little confusing, but I know from the patient advocacy community, biomarker testing or comprehensive biomarker testing is often what people are using to talk about this type of testing.
Awesome, thank you. So the con of tissue biopsy. So one would be, especially in lung cancer, often biopsies can be quite small. So if you think about it, if you need to run, you want to be able to look at all the DNA, right? So you have to have enough tissue to perform these tests. So I talked about the number of slides that we need. So tissue limitations, that can be, or the amount of tissue, that can be a con of tissue biopsy. The other one, which I didn't talk about, is tumor heterogeneity. So that's when, if you have a primary lung cancer and you have metastases throughout the body, a metastatic site may not have the same genomic makeup as a primary tumor. So if you do a liquid biopsy, you're taking a blood sample that has ctDNA from all the different tumors in the body. So it has a potential to give a more global look at the tumors, as opposed to a tissue biopsy where you're biopsying a single site. So you're really only getting a look at a single site. Those could be considered some of the cons around tissue biopsy.
I can answer the next question if you want, Katie.
Go ahead.
So it's hard to speak. So the question is, do you think insurance companies confuse genetic and genomic testing? Is this why they deny payment for testing? It may be called experimental, even though we know it's standard of care. So, you know, who knows what every insurance company might do. There might be some who would confuse genetic and genomic. Hopefully by now, most insurance companies would understand what it means that genomic, you're testing the tumor, versus genetic, you're testing everything that you inherit from your parents and that you could pass on to your kids. I think the idea of experimental, this is something that is pretty frustrating to see continue to happen now, even as we're approaching 10 years that comprehensive biomarker testing has been available, because not only is it not experimental, but our tests now and other tests by other companies are actually approved by the FDA as companion diagnostic tests, and also along with that are covered by Medicare for eligible patients. So I think the idea of saying experimental, if that's what you're hearing from your insurance company, is definitely worth pushing back on.
David and Katie, one of the things that happens in our group is whenever somebody has progression, you know, typically they just kind of think of it like as a process. Once you, you know, progress on alectinib, or we'll say seratinib, then you go to alectinib, then from alectinib, then you go to lorlatinib or brigatinib. But can you explain why biomarker testing in between those two things is important for us to choose the right drug?
Yeah. Oh, I'm not okay. Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to how that tumor has changed, right? So if you are progressing on one drug, that means something has happened in your tumor, something has changed to cause it to grow, and we want to know why, because the why will change what happens next. It helps your oncologist decide what's the next treatment choice. So depending upon your resistance pattern, that can change on whether you go on combination therapy, that was alluded to in the front of the talk, or whether you go on another ALK TKI. So seeing why that tumor isn't responding anymore can help make treatment choices. And that's why you do testing in between therapies.
In our group, we've seen people go from having ALK to having MET or having HER2, or how often does that happen? And can you just kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna show my resistance slide, or I can note it. So there's multiple signaling pathways in the cells that cause it to grow. So I would say about 20-ish% of the time, and again, it can depend on your TKI, you can get progression by, it's called bypass signaling. So instead of getting a mutation in ALK, you get a mutation in MET or HER2, which can cause that tumor to grow. So the tumor finds a way around that ALK TKI to continue to grow, and that's why it's called a bypass. So it's bypassing ALK, bypassing that ALK TKI, and using MET to grow, or using HER2 to grow, or EGFR. You can also see, and that's another reason to get tested, is because there are therapies out there for HER2 and MET and EGFR. Now therapies out there for KRAS. So understanding that bypass mechanism is another important reason to get tested.
When I look at Wendy's question there, the thing that stands out to me the most is that a lot of times insurance companies will deny liquid biopsy or even tissue biopsy. What kind of patient assistance programs do you know of so that we're not stuck with, you know, a huge bill or something like that? Is there anything available for patients?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about the billing process a little bit, including patient assistance programs, because I know that's often something that's top of mind. First of all, we don't want the cost of the test or the perceived cost of the test to be something that serves as a barrier to getting testing. And that's something that sometimes the doctor will hold off on ordering because of that concern, and patients won't even have the chance to really get the testing. First of all, I'll say for Medicare patients, if you have Medicare, as I was just mentioning, Medicare covers both our tissue and our liquid biopsy. And so we have the eligibility criteria, but it's basically if you have stage 3 or 4 cancer, if your physician will be using the results to inform your treatment, and a couple other ones. And if you have advanced cancer, and I assume that covers a lot of the people here, you know, that's likely going to apply to you. So in that case, if you have Medicare, no matter what other type of insurance you have, that means you would have no out-of-pocket expense. If you have private insurance, it's still a huge variation based on what type of insurance you have, based on where in the country you have. You could even, you know, for some types like national plans, they can vary for different parts of the country. So you can try to get an idea up front of what your insurance, if your insurance will cover it. You would find out what the name of the test is. We can even, sometimes your insurance would ask for a code called a CPT code. That's something we can provide. And they'll let you know if it's covered or not covered. If it is covered, there may still be a patient expense associated with that, a copay, coinsurance, or deductible. If they say it's denied or it won't be covered, then that's really where financial assistance could come into play. So you can, whether or not your insurance is going to cover the testing, you can apply for financial assistance at Foundation Medicine at any point before, during, or after testing. The website for that is aid.foundationmedicine.com. And you just kind of fill out some different pieces of information, and you'll get your response back within a couple of days. And that will let you know what assistance you would get on any out-of-pocket expense. So if your insurance is covering something, it'll be your remaining expense. If your insurance is not going to be covering, it would be off of the self-pay price. And so that can kind of give you an idea going into it what your maximum expense might be. But it can be kind of scary. People hear, you know, thousands of dollars. We can say from looking at past claims that 80% of patients, their out-of-pocket expense is $150 or less. So while there are some people who it can rise higher, the vast majority of people, it's not actually going to end up being as significant an expense.
So there's a question, how often is there no resistance mechanism found? So that's another one. It can depend on which TKI you're on. So if you're looking at like the second generation ALK TKIs, about 25 to up to 45% of the cases all still had wild type ALK. So they had the original fusion, but there was no secondary mutation found. And then how common is histology changes from adeno to squamous? So histology changes, yeah, can definitely occur. They tend to be like a little more rare. I would say less than 10% of the time. But they can still occur. Do I have to be progressing in order to request testing? So the short answer is no, you don't have to be progressing in order to get tested. But generally speaking, in order to get information on your tumor, the reason you test is to see how it's changing or why it's changing. And usually that's at the point of progression. The other reason to test at the time of progression also gets back to if the tumor is responding and shrinking. If you do a tissue biopsy, there may not be enough tissue there to biopsy. Hopefully, that would be fantastic. Or if you're trying to do a liquid biopsy and the tumor isn't actively growing, then there may not be enough ctDNA in the blood to detect. So that's why we say at the time of actual progression. So you actually increase our chances of detecting tumor DNA. Does it make sense to have two different brands of liquid biopsy? If so, what other brand besides yours would be best to complement? Yeah, so I would say test as much and as often as you can and you can be exposed to. So there are so many diagnostic companies out there and the panels are different, the genes are different, the coverage is different. Frankly, it's a very complicated landscape. So yes, I think if you have access or if your oncologist is encouraging you to use different assays or different genomic tests, then yes, you can. Frankly, Guardant 360 is another company out there that is very big in the liquid biopsy space. How long should you wait to retest? So at the point of progression, which I don't know if that's fully answering the time question, but if you're on alectinib and responding and doing well, then you'd really want to wait until that tumor is progressing on scans, and that tumor is growing, and that would be the time that you would retest. And my husband just had an MRI with new mets in the brain and meets with the doctor tomorrow. What can we tell his doctor to get a liquid biopsy? Do we tell his doctor to get a liquid biopsy? Interesting. So it would depend on, I hate to say it, but the overall tumor burden in your husband. So if it's only in the brain, because of the blood-brain barrier. So your brain is very protected from everything else in your body, right? You don't want everything flowing up into your brain. So that very tight blood-brain barrier can make it challenging to get even tumor DNA from the brain mets. So if it's only progressing in the brain, the chances of detecting circulating tumor DNA in the body, frankly, might be challenging. If there's tumor growing outside of the brain in other parts of the body, then a liquid biopsy could be an option. But if it's only CNS metastases, a liquid biopsy may not be the best way to go. I have recent results from your company. Some genomic findings say fusion, but not all. What is the difference between fusion and non-fusion? Yeah, so our company reports, we call them single nucleotide variants, which means that there is a one nucleotide that's been mutated to a different nucleotide. So that's a one piece to one piece sort of alteration. A fusion is one piece of DNA that's fused to another piece of DNA that normally isn't fused. So that could be why some of those alterations say fusion and some of them don't say fusion. That being said, if it's a foundation test, and you want to talk to somebody one-on-one about your specific results, then maybe we can circle around and have a conversation after the call about that. Happy to take a more specific look. Yeah. I know this is a very complicated subject.
You're doing a great job, Katie, breaking it down. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all for all the questions. I appreciate it.
I had a question about just brain metastasis. Is there any way that, I think Paul's asking it too, that we could test on cerebral spinal fluid instead of blood, or are there other things that you can do liquid biopsy on, like pleural effusion or pericardial effusion?
Yeah, so we can test pleural effusions for specifically cerebral spinal fluid. So at Foundation, we don't do that. It's a very hot topic. There are labs that do it. And I'm trying to think of the one off the top of my head. I think ARUP, ARUP, I think they're a commercial company that does do CSF testing. But yeah, we unfortunately don't do that at Foundation Medicine.
But you did say other kind of fluids could be tested, and we could look for circulating tumor DNA in that.
Yeah, so pleural fluid, it's actually interesting. So if a doctor draws pleural fluid, you actually spin it down and you collect, it actually turns into tissue. So you collect the cells that are in the pleural fluid, and we do genomic testing on the cells in the pleural fluid. So it's a fluid, but different than collecting from the blood. Different.
Yeah, and so that, I was just gonna say, so it's, you think of it as being fluid, but it's not, that's not considered a liquid biopsy. It's the same as what a tissue test would be, because you're creating this block out of it, and the liquid biopsy really just refers to testing the blood, so circulating tumor DNA in the blood itself.
Do different genomic testing companies share information? I'm gonna say the short answer to that's probably no. I mean, there's definitely collaborative research projects ongoing, but in general, not so much. How are the different companies regulated?
I guess I was wondering about share information with who, because
I assume they meant with each other.
That would be. Okay, got it.
But please, Kim, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, so how are different companies regulated, which is a really good question. So the lowest level of regulation is called CLIA, C-L-I-A. And so what that means is that lab has been certified on like a cleanliness level that they're able to operate a test. Foundation Medicine is FDA approved. So that's kind of it is the highest level of clearance that a test can have. So that means like we've given the FDA our assay, we've shown them our technology and our reporting, and the FDA's reviewed it and given us, FDA approval. So that's one way you can have confidence in an assay, is that FDA approval sort of level, so that you know that a third party has looked at our technology and given it approval. So that's the way you can have some assurance on the quality of tests that you have. Oh, David, I don't know if you can ask.
take the one about the insurance.
In network, yeah.
So the question is Foundation Medicine considered in network with any insurance company? So the answer is yes. First of all, Medicare, we are in network. So if you have Medicare and are eligible, it would be covered with no out-of-pocket expense. And then for private insurance companies, we are with some, and it actually varies. Having lung as the tumor type is the most expansive coverage. So if any type of cancer is going to be covered by insurance company, it's usually going to be lung, and sometimes more beyond that, just because there are more targeted therapies available based on genomic testing results for lung cancer. But it can get very specific, as much as, for a companion diagnostic test. And companion diagnostic is a certain level of review by the FDA, which is quite high. And so an insurance company might say, for example, if this is the only test available where there's a companion diagnostic, then it would be covered versus not. So the bottom line is, I would say, just check with your insurance company. It's hard to go like one by one. The best thing to do if you're considering getting testing and you're concerned about cost is just to check ahead of time.
Is the reason it's not tested on cerebral spinal fluid is because very little fluid is optioned that way. Can you test on 5 mils of fluid? So I think one of the reasons CSF just hasn't been widely adopted yet is it just hasn't been, the science is still catching up. So if you think about it, like when we develop a new assay, and that means we have to, like developing our liquid assay. So we have to get the blood, you have to figure out how to get the DNA from the blood. And now you have to figure out how much DNA do you need to run the assay. We have to make the assay, make sure that it works, right? Make sure we're identifying all the right patients and that we're not identifying any of the wrong patients. And that's a very long process. And so for spinal fluid, people are doing it. It just hasn't gotten to the point where it's commercially available yet, broadly. And I would say part of it's related to the amount of blood, because you have to make sure you get enough DNA to actually do the genomics on. So for our liquid assay, we need 2 tubes of blood. Each tube is about 8.5 milliliters. So that's how much we would need to run our liquid biopsy assay.
I can answer a couple frequently asked questions that we get, just in case you find it helpful. So one thing people wonder sometimes is, what's the overall process to testing? So we get the tissue or the blood sample sent to our lab, we extract the DNA, we are sequencing the DNA to see what mutations are covered. For both our liquid and our tissue tests, we're sequencing for 324 genes. And then based on the mutations we find, then we're looking to see what targeted therapies or immunotherapies are available based on those results. And then we produce a report that we send back to the doctor, listing the mutations as well as any targeted therapy or immunotherapy options. And that includes things that are currently in clinical trials. Patients can get a copy of your results, so it's not automatically sent to you, but if you call into our customer service, you can get a copy of the results. And in terms of time, we kind of say 10 to 14 days. A lot of the results are coming out even sooner than 10 days. So we recognize that turnaround time is really important, because often the reason you're getting the testing is you're trying to make your next treatment decision. And so we're getting to a point where, that's hopefully coming much more quickly, and, it's going to be available for your next appointment. So those are just a few questions we get sometimes.
The other comment I just wanted to add about liquid is that, as I mentioned, that if you get a negative liquid test, that you do want to follow up with tissue if you can. On the flip side of that is if you get a positive on liquid, so if you find an actionable alteration on a liquid test, they do respond to therapy. So there was a trial actually specifically for ALK patients that the patients were enrolled only on liquid biopsy. So they were not enrolled based on a tissue biopsy, just a liquid biopsy. If they had an ALK fusion, they went on alectinib, and they responded just as well as the patients who were identified on tissue. So if you have an alteration identified on liquid, you can respond just as well as if you were identified by tissue. If that makes sense. Is there a difference between tissue biopsies obtained from primary tumor versus mets? And pardon me why I read. The tumor biopsy came from a liver met because they were identified before. The liver biopsy seemed like a relatively simple procedure compared to the possible complications of the lung. Some people feel the tumor sample must come from the primary site. So the primary tumor and a metastatic site may not have the same genomic makeup. That being said, biopsying a metastatic site happens, all the time. Yes, there can be multiple complications trying to get a biopsy in the lung because of location. And by all means, your interventional radiologist or who's ever doing the biopsy and your oncologists are definitely the experts when it comes to that. 100% follow their guidance. So there may be differences in a primary and metastatic site when it comes to the DNA. Yes, that is a potential. But again, that happens all the time where you biopsy one site versus another. It also, depending upon how your oncologist feels, if you're biopsy the metastatic site and that comes back negative, then there is the option to follow up with a liquid biopsy. If your oncologist or you feel very strongly that you want to keep on looking for something, you'll want to look for an acquired resistance mechanism, or you want to look for another tumor driver, a liquid biopsy could be another option in that case. It was on my kind of strengths and limitations slide, but it's another reason where liquid biopsy can come into play, where if tissue is inaccessible, if there's some reason that you can't undergo a tissue biopsy, whether it's your choice, whether there's too many complications with a tissue biopsy, that's another option for liquid. Can you do a tissue biopsy on a lymph node or just a tumor? Yes, you can do it on a lymph node. My liquid biopsy was negative, but my tissue was positive. Yes, that is common. It doesn't, I don't want to say it doesn't mean anything, but your liquid could have been negative just because there wasn't enough circulating tumor DNA to detect. It's one of those purely technical reasons. Has to do with assay or with the technology and how genomics are run, is that if there's not enough circulating tumor DNA for us to detect, then it's going to come out as a negative assay. It doesn't mean it's not there. It just means there wasn't enough of it there for us to read. So a negative liquid and a positive tissue can definitely happen.
Katie, I just also wanted to add about not being able to get results, which is true for either liquid or tissue. Sometimes you need to have enough tumor DNA to be able to get results. And we have these different steps throughout our process to make sure it passes those quality checks. So the upfront step for tissue is that we look at it under a microscope to make sure there's enough tissue and that there's enough concentration of tumor in that tissue. And then also in the blood, we're looking to see that there's enough tumor DNA. But if we're not able to get results, then you have some options. If you had a tissue test, that might be a reason to get a blood biopsy or a liquid biopsy test. Or, if you have an older sample, you can actually work backwards. Often you'd want to start with your most recent tissue sample available, but if you have something from previous, then you could try that. Or of course, if you have a new biopsy in the future, that's something else you could try. So, more options for you trying to get results.
Is a tumor biopsy and a MET biopsy, are the results the same? So that's the heterogeneity. So the metastatic site can be different than the primary tumor site. They can be the same, but they can be different. And that's why we call it personal genomics and your own personal test. So if you're getting a tissue biopsy, yes, they can be different. That's a short answer. Our contact information, please feel free to email. Is there a new lesion? If there's a new lesion in the brain, is it probably because there's a new biomarker? So that can also depend on therapy. So alectinib has great CNS brain penetration. But so you have your primary tumor in the lung, and then you have brain mets that are growing. So if the drug isn't getting to the brain, then those brain mets are probably going to grow. So that's one reason why they would grow. They're not even getting exposed to the initial drug, so they grow. But if they are getting exposed to the drug and they're still progressing, it could be because of acquired resistance and because of a new biomarker or a new mutation that's happening. So either the drug's not getting to the brain and they're growing, or the drug's getting to the brain and then that tumor is changing. So honestly, it could be either case.
I wanted to add for getting a liquid biopsy, a service that we have available is called mobile phlebotomy, meaning that you can actually have a phlebotomist or a person who draws your blood could actually come to your home to do that, just to save yourself a visit to your doctor's office. And so if that's something you would be interested in, you could call into our client services phone number, which I put in the chat, and get that arranged. Any other questions from folks?
I was just gonna like as a wrap, I'm not as necessarily as a wrap up, but as a, tissue is, I think, still considered generally a gold standard in the oncology world. And tissue, frankly, is always going to be needed for diagnosis and to actually obviously physically look at tumor cells and see what they look like. But we are very excited about liquid biopsy. Again, it's the best time to use it is when your tumor is actively growing, actively progressing, and shedding tumor DNA. So the more tumor you have, the more circulating tumor DNA you're going to have in your blood. So that tumor should be progressing in order to do a blood draw. And that was it, Summer.
I was just going to say it was just about 8. Thank you guys so much, David and Katie, for your very informative talk and answering all of our questions. We so appreciate it. And I hope you all saw too in the chat, David and Katie's contact information is in there. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, for sure. And in the way that we usually do it is we all unmute and say thank you. So if there's not anything else, if you all want to unmute yourselves and say thank you to David and Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. There's something else in the chat. Okay, then I will go ahead and end the Zoom, but thank you so much, David and Katie. We are so grateful for your time this Sunday.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having
so
us.
much.
Thank you.
We really
Yes,
appreciate
thank
it.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, you too. Bye-bye.